Welcome everyone to the Tap into the Rain webinar. We'll be getting started in just a few minutes. Let people join. In the meantime, if you wouldn't mind filling out this poll, what is your top reason for attending tonight? Great, as people are joining, new people, welcome. We're going to get started. Let a few people join and you can fill out the poll while you're waiting. And I'm Lisa Duba, the Clean Water Program Outreach Contractor, and I'll be your host tonight. And we have three great speakers who are ready to share their knowledge with you. We'll just give it another minute for people to log on. Okay, looks like our attendee add-ons are a little bit steady here. So in the interest of keeping us on track, I'm going to say to end the poll and see what top interest here. We've got, you can share the results with our viewers. Looks like rain barrels is our top choice. That's great, but all our topics tonight are really great ways to tap into the rain and keep our precious water on site on our properties, keep our homes beautiful and resilient. So we'll get started now. A few notes on how to interact on the webinar. If you can put questions in the Q&A box and any comments you might have in the chat. We'll do our best to monitor them and answer as many questions as we can. For Q&A box, you can also upvote a question that you see that's maybe a similar question to yours. Instead of adding another question, if there's one that is very similar to yours, just go ahead and upvote it, and that helps us know which are the most popular questions. We'll be answering a few questions as we can tonight, but after the webinar, we're also going to send all the attendees a link with to a PDF of fact sheets and resources for you to get more detailed information on these topics, as well as where you can get help for any project that you might have. We'll also be recording the webinar, so you'll be able to rewatch it or revisit the topics. That will be on our YouTube channel and our website. And we'll also share links at the end of the presentation and in our follow-up email so you can find us again. Okay, with that, we're going to go to our first speaker, Barbara Silva from the city of Fremont, who will introduce the Clean Water Program, the host for the webinar today. But while she speaks, we're going to do another poll. We'd love to know where you're located, and this helps us with our promotional planning. Take it away, Barbara.
Hello, everybody. Welcome, and I want to thank you for joining us this evening for this webinar, Tap into the Rain. This webinar is hosted by the Clean Water Program of Alameda County, and we shorten that name by calling it the program. The program is responsible for ensuring our cities in Alameda County meet the Federal Clean Water Act guidelines to protect our local creeks, wetlands, and the San Francisco Bay. Every city in Alameda County is a member of the program, as well as two special districts. We have Zone 7 Water Agency and the Alameda County Flood Control and Water Conservation Districts. You can learn more about the program on our website, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube channel. On those channels, you do a search that says the Clean Water Program and then look it up on Facebook. We're glad you're here to learn more about keeping rainwater on our property. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Barbara. With that, we're going to go to our first speaker, Suzanne Bontempo of Plant Harmony and Our Water, Our World, who's going to show us a little bit of some of the higher level basic concepts about why it's beneficial to capture rainwater on site.
Thank you, Lisa. So when we have rain, we want to look at how to keep the rainwater on site instead of letting it run off into the storm drains. By keeping this rainwater on site, it benefits our home landscape, recharging the soil, which supports the plant health, which is especially important during times of drought like we're in now. Also, when rainwater can stay on the property, it prevents pollutants from reaching our creeks, wetlands, and the bay. In today's webinar, we will cover some simple practices to tap into the rain. We won't have time for detailed instructions, but we will share resources with you, as Lisa mentioned, so that you can learn more. And we'll also allow time to answer some questions. Next slide, please. So let's compare what happens when rain falls in a natural area compared to the city. An urban area generates substantially more runoff than it would in a natural open space. In nature, about 50% of the rainwater that gets to soak into the soil, whereas in developed areas, it's on average just about 15%. So also keep in mind how deeply the water can be absorbed into the ground depends on the type of soil that what the soil is made up of. For example, clay soil, like we have throughout the Bay Area, or compacted soil allows water to absorb more slowly and less deeply. This shallow infiltration will go deep enough to water plant roots and recharge creeks. Soils that are more porous, less clay-like, will allow water to reach deeper. And this deep infiltration allows the water to reach lower lying aquifers and recharge groundwater. Next. So what happens with all the rainwater that becomes runoff? Next. It goes to the storm drain, but along the way it picks up any litter, pet waste, pesticides, motor oil, and pollutants from the streets and sidewalks as it flows into the storm drain. Next. And these pollutants end up in our creeks, our wetlands in the bay, not going to a water treatment facility first. So when we have a rain event, the water that becomes runoff can quickly pick up leaves, limbs, and other debris that will block or clog the storm drains. When we have big downpours that create larger volumes of rainwater per hour, which is now what we experience more often due to the impacts of climate change, these downpours overwhelm the storm drains, which can cause flooding. This photo was taken in a front curb of a house in Berkeley. What was it last? I believe it was last winter, correct? I think the last rainy season. Anyway, thanks. Even if the rain stays on our property, it can cause problems if not managed properly, as in this photo. Next. So when we have rain, we want to look at how we can keep that really valuable rainwater on site instead of letting it run off into the storm drains. By keeping the rainwater on site, it recharges the soil, which supports the plant health, which is especially important during times of drought. Also, when rainwater can stay on our property, it prevents pollutants from reaching our creeks, wetlands, and the bay. We want to keep rainwater on our properties in a way that is correct, and we have a few options for that. So let's dive in. So believe it or not, compost and mulch really help with this. When we add organic matter in the form of compost to our soil, we help the soil become more of a sponge, allowing that water to be absorbed into that soil. By increasing the organic matter in your soil to 5%, that's always the goal, we quadruple the water holding capacity, which is amazing. And it is that simple. With mulch, by covering the soil with 2 to 3 inches of a hardwood chunky mulch, such as fir chips or arbor mulch, this mulch layer protects the soil, allowing rainwater to soak into the soil. Soil without a mulch layer will have a dry crust on top of it, making that soil hydrophobic, which prevents the water from soaking in with ease. A 2 to 3 inch layer of mulch also reduces the water evaporation rate, reducing how often we need to water by at least 20%. This mulch also insulates the soil, helping to keep that soil cool in the summer and warm in the winter, and also helps prevent erosion. To learn more, refer to the research page that we have provided that will be emailed to you shortly.
Great, thank you, Suzanne. Now we're going to go to our next speaker, Stephanie Prugel. She's a San Leandro resident she's installed her own rain cistern system on her property, and she's going to share her knowledge and experience with us today. Take it away, Stephanie.
Thanks, Lisa. I'm excited to talk about rain barrels and cisterns. And as you might imagine, the purpose is to capture rain runoff off of your roof and store it either for the dry season, or in the case of smaller barrels, you actually store it and release it and store it and release it over the course of the winter to take advantage of that sponge capacity that your soil has, especially if you've amended it like Suzanne just explained. So what you see here are some of the larger cisterns and tanks. They're 5 gallons or more, can be 1,000, even 2,000 gallons large. They can not only be above ground, but often also below ground. Some people have them under their decks. And in that case, they are really for storage. Like they might fill up once during the rainy season, and then you'll have it in the next dry season. Next slide. What we might have seen more often, or you're more familiar with, are these smaller barrels. They're like a drum, 55-gallon drum size. It can be sort of 50 to 200 gallons each. And those are great for storage as well, but they also are good to catch and release, if you will. So during a rainstorm, they fill up, and then a few days later, you release that water when your soil has, again, capacity to soak up water, because the rainwater that fell has gone into deeper layers, and then you can really take advantage of the soil's capacity to store water. Next slide. You can, depending on the space you have, also link smaller barrels. You don't have to get one giant one. That's called daisy chained, as you see here. It's one inlet and one spigot where you take out the water, and they're all kind of linked together like one big container. Next one. So a few considerations. Where would you want to put these barrels? Is your site good? And this might be really obvious, but you do need downspouts and gutters. My house, for example, didn't even have gutters. I had to put some in and downspouts before I was able to put my rainwater storage in. And the other thing that's important is that you have a landscaped area where you want to release the water. So in most cases, we want this water to irrigate our gardens. This is not for indoor use, but also think about the overflow, and we'll get to that in a moment. You'll want to be able to release that water into the garden, have an area where it can absorb. Next one. So another really important one, especially if you have larger tanks in mind, is that you have a level and firm surface for these above ground barrels. And if you consider a 55-gallon drum or one of those 60-gallon barrels, when they're full, that's like 400 pounds. So that's a good weight. So for the smaller barrels, like flagstones or even cinder blocks or sort of a gravel bed are good. You want them just to be level and kind of sit there stable. But something larger, like you see here, you may want to have a concrete foundation or a bigger concrete slab, and you may even want to strap them to the wall, as you see here in the picture, so they don't like fall over, maybe during an earthquake. Next one. And then the last one here, as I mentioned earlier, you want to be able to have overflow flow into your landscaping or somewhere where it doesn't flood your foundation or cause damage, of course. So in this picture here, you see the white overflow pipe. So should that 1,000-gallon barrel get full, it overflows and then gets diverted into the backyard through this perforated drain pipe. Those are cheap drain pipes you get at Home Depot or somewhere else, and they would disperse the water. And in this case, the landscape's also sloped a little bit away from that tank, so it flows away from your house. Next one. So now, big question: how do you figure out how big your barrels should be? All that sizing stuff. It really depends on a few different questions. I think the most limiting for us as homeowners is how much room do we have? How much space do we have to put, that stable that maybe has a concrete slab I can sit my tanks on? How much space do you have? And then how much roof are you gonna kind of utilize to catch water? So what portion of your roof are you gonna divert the water from? And then lastly, how much rain are we even gonna get? And I know some people have commented like, oh, we're not even gonna get any rain. Why even have barrels? But the good news is that even what seems like little rain, once you start catching it and storing it, it actually really adds up. I want to show you the next slide, just sort of a rule of thumb. So say you have a 1 inch, what we call rain event. So an inch of rain falls on the ground. Say you have 100 square feet of your roof that you divert into your tanks. That is a 60-gallon water amount. So just about enough to fill one of those blue barrels there that you see in the picture. Last winter, we had a really dry winter. Oakland, for example, only got an average of 8 inches. Usually it would be 20 to 27, depending on where you are. That differs throughout the Bay Area, like Tri-Valley, you guys get less rain, some areas get more. But now imagine 8 inches. If you had just like one of these barrels, it would have filled up 8 times. And that's just from 100 square feet of roof. You would probably have more like 500 square feet. So then you have like 40 barrels worth of water. And that's where the sort of catch and release really comes in and is important. Let's move on to the next slide. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on the design and installation, but our follow-up resources will have a lot of detail on that. For those smaller barrels and containers, you can get kits. They're not that expensive, where you can hook it up yourself. They have like diverters and the overflow pipe and the spigot. It's a nice DIY project. For the bigger ones, it's really good idea to hire somebody. That's what I did with my system that I'm going to show you on the next slide. So here I am proudly with my 3,000-gallon cisterns. So I have 3,000 gallons, and next slide. The way they get filled, this is sort of a footprint of my roof. My house is pretty small, so the roof is usually about the same footprint. If you don't have a plan like I happen to have, you could even use Google Maps to just gauge your roof. I'm using about half of my roof, 430 square feet. On the right, where you see that sort of misshapen round there, that was my first barrel. I have 3 lined up there now because I added on after I saw how much they actually fill up. And now calculating with our rule of thumb that I shared earlier, if I have a 1 inch rain event, I actually get about a quarter of one of those tanks full, 258 gallons. To fill them all, I need almost 12 inches. So last winter, I didn't get them all full, but it was really nice to have all that water, and it lasted me, I want to say, through July for my drought tolerant yard. Next slide. This is a view from above, so you can see how the gutter sort of funnels into pipes that go into the middle tank. So my tanks are linked together, so it only feeds into one, and they all 3 fill up at the same time. You see a little bit of what goes straight down here, a little obscured by my plant. In the next slide, you see a little better. Oh, here's the daisy chained connection between the tanks. Next slide. So it's called a first flush device. And I want to just comment on that briefly because it's important. So when you have the first rain, that's why it's called first flush, because it'll wash all that bird poop and leaves and all that dirt off your roof. And you don't want that in your tanks. So this device just diverts the first few gallons. And then it's a very simple system where a ball floats up and plugs that pipe and then gets the rest into your tanks. So the first flush device, I'll show you what that looks like in my system on the next slide. Gets just put in between. You see here on the left, comes down from the gutter. What goes straight down is that diverter, that first flush device. Once that's full, it goes to the right and into my tanks. And on the right here, you see the bottom of that first flush diverter, and it just slowly drains out once it's full. Next slide. So one important aspect is to keep mosquitoes out. So for the larger barrels, they have this kind of screen that you see here on the left. It also catches dirt. So once a year, you need to clean that out before the rainy season starts again, and it keeps mosquitoes out. Make sure that also your overflow pipe has a little screen in there. for the simpler DIY, smaller barrel systems, you can just use a mesh that you tightly put over the top to keep mosquitoes out and dirt as well. Next one. Just a quick note on how you use that water, especially with the larger tanks. You can easily just use gravity. You see that spigot on the bottom there and hook up your hose, or use a little booster pump like I have to, especially when the barrel gets, or the cistern gets a little less full, to push that water out for watering.
2-minute
All
warning,
right.
Steph. 2-minute warning.
All right, thanks, Lisa. And we're almost done. So there are some rebates, although not in all Alameda County cities. Check our resource packet to see if your city qualifies. And now we'll have time for a few questions.
Yeah, so we'll take 1 or 2 questions now, and then if your question is in the Q&A, it's a lot easier for us to answer it. So after we move on to the next speaker, Stephanie will spend some time answering the questions in the Q&A box and possibly the chat if she can find them. So let's see, our top voted questions are, let's see, some of the larger gallons, 600 to 1,200 gallon water tanks are pretty expensive, around $1,000, looking for an inexpensive way to save rainwater and not spend thousands of dollars to set up the system. Is that possible, Stephanie?
Yeah, so those are important questions. My tanks were about 750 for the 1,000-gallon ones. I found that the simpler sort of cylinder-shaped ones are the cheaper ones. If you get fancy of the flat ones or other shapes, those get more expensive. I have seen that people also sell them secondhand. So it might take a little bit of poking around. I'd advise you to talk to an installer. We have a few groups here in the Bay Area that know a lot about this, to connect you with maybe farmer supplies stores that might have actually used ones, and you could save that way. But I think if you get 1,000-gallon tank for $500 to $700, that's a deal.
Okay, and then how do you determine which part of your roof gives you the best runoff? Is that something a contractor does, or can the average Joe figure that out?
I mean, I actually didn't ask anybody. I went by which was most convenient for my landscaping. So for most of us, I think you'll see, well, where's my yard? Where can I most use that water? And then just take that part of the roof. Unless your roof is a flat roof, you should be fine with the average slant of the roof. I don't think there's any concern, or that you have to really select so much.
Okay, and the next question, I think you touched on it a little bit about how long your water supply lasted, but we don't get rain very much through April and October, and full rain barrels will deplete quickly in spring and not refill again for 6 months. Do you think, all in all, is it worth it to put in a rain barrel for the Bay Area?
So when I put in my big tanks, I was really thinking, okay, I'm going to save this water and then use it in the summer. And I made a point of having drought tolerant plants. I have a pretty large yard, but I was able to water, say, just once a month, and deeply water. That's also a way to save water. And I was almost through the summer good on my tank in spite of the drought. So it lasted me from May through early August. So totally worth it. But for smaller barrels, I'm really excited about the way to use the soil as a sponge, the catch and release, because it's actually amazing how much the soil can hold or not hold if it doesn't get any. If you have a heavy rain event and then it dries out, if you can space it out to where you it sips water from your tanks rather than just that one heavy downpour, I can really tell if my soil has recharged over the winter or not.
Okay, so the smaller rain barrels help you kind of water and recharge the soil with water in between rainstorms, and that really helps. Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we're going to have to wrap up this section, and we're going to go to our next speaker, bring her back actually, Suzanne Bontempo of Plant Harmony, and she's going to talk to us about rain gardens.
Okay, well, hopefully everyone will be as excited about rain gardens as they were the rain barrels, but it's hard to compete with Stephanie's amazing rain catchment system. But rain gardens are a landscaped area designed to receive the rainwater that runs over our roof, sidewalks, patios, and other paved surfaces, and helps that water absorb into the ground. It can also take an overflow from the rain barrel, as Stephanie just explained. A rain garden allows the water to stay on site instead of running off into the storm drain. The goal with the rain garden is to slow it, spread it, and sink it. Installing a rain garden is a low impact solution that provides many benefits. Rain gardens are beautiful, relatively easy to install, relatively inexpensive. They support pollinators, beneficial insects, they moderate temperatures, and they assist with carbon sequestration. Next slide. And a rain garden, just like a regular garden bed, but instead of a regular garden bed, it has a slight depressed surface. So imagine instead of a raised garden berm or mound, think of this in reverse. It's a shallow depressed or shallow basin that collects rainwater runoff. Rain gardens help restore the natural balance in our landscapes by holding back and soaking in that extra runoff. Next slide. A rain garden can hold water that is diverted to it so that the water can slow its flow and soak in slowly. Much of this water is used by the plants. If there's too much water, it will spill over and flow into areas where it would have if you didn't have a rain garden. Rain gardens should drain within 12 to 24 hours and definitely no longer than 2 to 3 days to prevent mosquitoes from growing and other issues that come from long-term pooling water. Next slide, please. There are many ways to incorporate a rain garden into your landscape. They are feasible for most properties, large or small. The rain garden will make a huge difference with your garden, and all your plants will reap the rewards. Next slide. It can be as simple as diverting rainwater from a gutter downspout out to a rain garden. Rocks at the opening of the downspout extension help slow the flow of the water, and it also grabs sediment. Okay, next. They can be placed, rain gardens can be placed next to a walkway or a driveway, directing the water away from that path and into the driveway, into the rain garden. We want to always include rocks at the flow entrance to slow that water flow and to catch sediment, as you can see in these pictures. They're also going to just be ever so slightly sloped away from that walkway or that surface. Next slide, please. All right. So, the side strip. So understand that rain gardens can be any shape. You want to locate your rain garden anywhere where they're in the path of flowing rainwater and where the soil allows the water to soak in. Okay, next. A good location should be at least 10 feet from the home or other structures, 3 feet from a sidewalk, and 5 feet from a property line. You always want to grade that landscape ever so slightly away from the house so that the water can flow away from the house and other structures. They're relatively, rain gardens are relatively flat. They're not going to be as significantly shaped as like a bowl or a pond. We are not creating a pond at all. This is just really a subtle indentation that is going to be able to capture the water. You can check and see if you've got a good draining soil, a spot that has good draining soil. And we do this by digging a hole, filling it with water, and then watching how fast that water drains. If it drains in less than 24 hours, then that's a perfect spot. All right, next. So we want to consider how much water is going to, how much water do we want to be able to capture from a roof or from an overflow of a rain barrel? The minimum size of our rain garden is going to be 4% of the square footage of that roof. Next slide, please. And so here we have this illustration that I think is pretty great. Now, again, the 4% is a minimum, and it's a very small minimum. So you can go a little bit larger. You know, you can go up to 10%. That's great. But this is just to start. We're going to look at the square footage of the roof or the area where that water is running off into the downspout, the gutter, and then into the downspout. So the minimum size of this 500 square foot roof, 4% of that is going to be the minimum size of 20 square feet. So very small, very easy to manage. So you get a little bit of space, can really hold a lot of water. Next slide, please. So let's just have a closer look at this illustration again. Rain gardens are going to be about 6 inches deep. However, if the soil is less porous and more clay-like, we might go a little more shallow, 3 to 5 inches. It's going to have a very gradual sloping edge and a fairly flat bottom. Again, rain gardens are not built like ponds are, and we want to avoid building a rain garden above utilities like gas lines or electrical lines. Next slide, please. You want to check how quickly the soil in that location drains before starting. The same trick that I just shared. And depending on the type of soil you have, it might dictate the size of the rain garden. So in some cases where the soil might drain a little bit more slowly because of the heavy clay, you might want to consider making that rain garden a little wider. Or you might consider incorporating multiple rain gardens. So a few smaller rain gardens at each downspout, okay? We're also going to, dig out that soil, level the edges, loosen the bottom 12 inches, and we're going to mix in about 3 inches of compost. We're going to consider adding those rocks or gravel at the entry so that water can flow in with ease. Plants for our rain garden. So what we want to do is we want to consider a very sunny location. That's going to be the best. Sun, part shade is fine too, but really the sunnier the better. We're going to choose native flowering perennials, clump grasses, and other shrubs. California natives are the best because they adapt to our climate and support our local habitat. Next slide, please. California natives like yarrow, Pacific Coast irises, and so many others are ideal choices because not only are they beautiful and they support our pollinators and our beneficial insects and our native bees, but these California natives are also going to thrive through the winter wet season as well as the summer dry conditions once these plants are established. Next slide. So with maintenance, maintenance is something to consider. The two takeaways with maintenance is that you want to keep your rain garden working and you want to keep it looking good. So the number one I would say is we want to watch out for the weeds. We want to remove them at first sight. This might seem a little overwhelming at first, but once those plants are more established, trust me, you're going to have less weeds because those plants are going to outcompete for the weeds. So we're going to hand pull or dig out the weeds upon first sighting. We want to avoid using herbicides that can kill other desirable plants. So, avoid the herbicides. Also understand that these herbicides can leach into the waterways, and understand also that most of the herbicides are actually top kills only. So though they're killing the top, they're actually not killing the roots, which only makes the roots stronger, which grows a bigger, stronger weed. We're going to design our planting area so that the plants, when fully established, will cover the surface area pretty well, but not completely. We don't want to crowd the plants too much. This is only going to lead to more trimming and more plant maintenance. Until the plants are established, you will need to water according to the needs of that plant when it's not raining. But once those plants are established, they should be able to handle the winter wet season, summer dry season fine. Mulch is key. We're going to cover that soil with 2 to 3 inches of mulch to protect the soil and keep the plants healthy while they become established. After a rain event, we're going to replace any mulch that was washed out. We're also going to remove sediment and debris that may have accumulated. It's important not to bury the plant stems for too long, so we always want to remove any debris that might be around the base of these plants. And we also want to ensure that the inlets are clear so that the water can flow into the rain garden with ease. Next slide. So by using a rain garden to absorb runoff before it enters a storm drain, you are part of the solution. So I hope you got excited and inspired And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, let me see here. So what's the difference between a rain garden and a swale?
A swale typically is going to have more of a berming area sides that's going to direct water. So in some cases, if you have like a subtle slope across your property and the water just seems to stream down the slope, you might create some berms and swales to divert the water into other areas, like maybe towards a rain garden.
Okay. Let's see. Can you use rubber compost?
I would not. Compost, it's really important that it is all natural. We want to take advantage of all the microbiology that we find in the compost. That's actually going to aid in the health of the soil and really, allow those root systems to grow deeper and expand wider. And during the times of summer dry, the microbiology that is in really good quality compost actually is helping those plant root systems access water on a molecular level. So that's, it's always really important to add good quality organic compost to our soils.
Someone would like clarification on the side strip photo where the rain garden was right next to the house, or was it? And how would that work with the 10 feet away from the foundation rule? I could try to go back to that.
I think
slide.
that it was, that with the downspout.
This one?
I think that's the front, like fencing.
Yeah, that's not the house foundation, we don't think. Yeah. It looks like a walkway and a fence. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Whoops. All right. I think we have another minute. Let's see here. What are the best native plants for a rain garden?
I would say California native plants that can really do extremely well during with a wet rainy season and then a very dry summer season. So you want to reach out to the California Native Plant Society, Calscape, local master gardeners. There's a lot of amazing resources out there that we're going to include in that resource packet that will be emailed to you shortly, and I would go from there. And then I would pick plants that I think are really beautiful because there's so many to choose from.
Okay. Last one. What is a good rain garden for a gentle sloping yard where most of the yard slopes towards the building?
Oh, that's
Is that possible to have one?
Yeah, I would probably take advantage of those rain barrels and then have the rain barrels where they're above maybe the grade of they're elevated above a rain garden, and then the overflow would then go into that great rain garden.
Okay.
You might have to talk to an engineer or, some type of a landscape contractor to help you with that.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Suzanne.
Thank you.
Yep. We're going to go on to our final speaker. If you remember from the introduction, where we learned about how pavement in developed areas prevents water from soaking in the ground, our next speaker, Peter Schultz-Allen, senior scientist at EOA, is going to show us some alternatives to pavement and concrete. Take it away,
Right.
Peter.
Thanks, Lisa. So yes, pervious pavement is a type of pavement that allows the water to flow through and go into the soil. So sometimes there are different ways this can occur, and we'll talk about that. But as opposed to the water running off the surface in an impervious pavement, where we talked about all the problems of that. So let's go to the next slide. So how does pervious pavement work? Well, this image here shows 3 different types, but there are other types as well. But basically the concept is that the water, or in this case, stormwater from rain or runoff, is going through the pavement, not across it or away from it. So it goes through the pavement. It can go through a porous asphalt or pervious concrete or different types of pavers that we'll show you. And it's a system with underlying gravel and rock as well. So usually underneath these different systems on the surface is pervious, but down below you might also have some rock as well. So next slide. There's a more detailed graphic showing with pervious pavers on the top there. In this case, these concrete pervious pavers are what you see at the surface. And then the water can flow through either the paver itself. Some of the pavers actually allow water to go through them, or sometimes it goes through the gaps between the pavers. And it goes down into these different rock layers and then into the soil below. Sometimes you also have an underdrain that would allow excess water, especially if you have clay soils, that excess water could go out through the underdrain and then maybe back to the storm drain system. But I think for most homeowners, you're probably not going to have an underdrain system, but you could consider that, especially if you have a large paved area, or maybe there's water that's going to be collecting there. So next slide. So these are some different types of pervious pavement. As I mentioned, porous asphalt, pervious concrete, interlocking pavers. There are other types of pavers as well. You have grid pavement like the one on the left there. And then you can also just use gravel or pavement strips, and I'll show you some examples of that. Next slide. So some considerations when you're installing a pervious pavement system or thinking about installing a system. You want to think about the type of use. Is it going to have a lot of weight on it with vehicles, for example? So that's your loading calculations. And if you're going to have a lot of weight on it, then you might not be able to use certain types of pervious pavement systems. You also are more likely to need that rock layer underneath that will help with the loading issues as well and give it structural support. So just like tile in your bathroom, if the tile is not installed correctly, it will crack. And the same thing can happen with these paving systems if they're not installed correctly. So the use, as I mentioned, vehicles, of course, would probably be the most difficult or most engineering needed. Then you might use it for play. And if it's for play, you might not want to have a really rough surface. Some of these pervious pavement systems are more rough than others. And then you have maybe just sitting on a patio would probably be the easiest system or with the least requirements. You want to think about drainage, and pervious pavement is a little different from regular pavement. Regular pavement, the idea is that it's sloped away from the house and it's sloped to a drain or to the street. If you have too much slope with the pervious pavement, then it's not going to work very well. So you want it to be a little bit flatter than a regular, maybe if your driveway has a lot of slope to it, then it's probably not going to work very well to use pervious pavement. Also maintenance, you don't want to have a lot of trees maybe that are right over the pervious pavement, because the leaves, unless you blow them away or collect them quickly, rake them up, they could break down and clog up the pervious pavement system. You also want to consider construction costs. As I mentioned, the most expensive are probably the ones with the biggest weight. So that could be an issue. And then your underlying soil, you don't want to compact it if you can, because you want to allow the water to infiltrate into it. Next slide. So here's an alternative. Instead of putting in some kind of new pervious pavement system, you can also remove or depave the pavement that you have. And maybe you don't need really pavement at all. In this case, here's a front entrance to a house. They're removing a concrete sidewalk, and maybe they're going to just put in gravel or some mulch or some landscaping. And so that's, of course, one of the best ways is just to remove impervious surfaces. Next slide. Here's an alternative driveway that people used to call the Hollywood driveway. It's also called a ribbon driveway. And this is just strips of regular pavement, in this case, regular concrete, but with gravel in between them. So then that allows the water to soak into the gravel area. And so small amounts of impervious surfaces are okay as long as they can drain to landscaping or gravel areas. Next slide. Here's another, oh, and these are both on my street, actually. This is a new house that was recently remodeled, and they put in this driveway here. You probably can't see it very well, but there are little strips of gravel in between these large concrete areas. It's unlikely that the water is a lot of the runoff is gonna get into that gravel area, it really, if it was made to be pervious, those gravel strips would have to be bigger, or there'd have to be more of them. But it's interesting to me that this designer thought that that is a good, modern driveway. And so the concept is good. It's just not quite enough of it. Next slide. So then you can also just have a gravel driveway. In this case, they're compacting it with that device there. And that's okay on the surface, but it's really the underlying soil that we have to be careful about compacting. But a regular gravel driveway, it works fine. Next. Then the next level up would be to use gravel with a grid support. This is a parking lot at a winery in Napa that I went to. And so they have a parking lot with about 20 cars. They even have some trees in the middle of the parking lot there between the spaces. And they use this modular grid support system, you can see in the middle picture there. And that gives more support for cars. If it didn't have cars on it, you wouldn't probably need that. But because of the car parking, they added that support. Next slide. So here's a driveway with pervious concrete. This pervious concrete is poured in place. So it comes like in a big concrete truck, and it's mixing in the truck, and they pour it in place. It does have to cure for a couple days typically, so that can be an issue. You might not be able to use the driveway. It can be sometimes irregular in how pervious it is, depending on the mix and how good the installer is. But the advantage is that it has these curving areas. It can fit, of course, to any shape that you want. It doesn't have to be a square, kind of like when with pavers, or the pavers have to be cut to match the curve. So it does have that advantage. Next slide. Here's another parking area with grid pavers. I would say this is best for low weight vehicles, or maybe if it's used occasionally. So these grid pavers can work well. I think in the Bay Area, it's probably best just to put gravel in them. You can have weeds growing in them, but maybe that's not so bad as long as the weeds are not causing a problem. But in the Bay Area with our dry climate, it's probably better just to have gravel in there. And I have seen these break if they're larger vehicles are running over them. So it's probably best for lightweight uses. Next slide. And here's a patio with interlocking concrete pavers, and they're on top of a gravel layer, which is good. So that'll provide some storage for water. And I'm assuming there's probably clay soil below that gravel layer. So that'll help with that. You'll notice that there's no liner here, and that's important to. There's no plastic liner underneath the pavers. And also you can see those gaps in between the pavers that it's best if you come back later and put gravel, a very fine gravel, in those spaces between the pavers. Next slide. So these pavers here, to me, it doesn't look like there's gravel in those gaps between them. It could be that this is a kind of paver that where the water flows through the paver itself. And the advantage of those kind of pavers is that you don't need to rely on those gaps. The water flows through the paver itself. So then you don't have these gaps in there that you have to be concerned with. But you don't want to use sand in any case in those gaps, because the sand clogs up pretty quickly. Next slide. Here's also a house down the street from me that was putting in something, I'm not quite sure what it is, but they're putting down this fabric, which I don't recommend. Even for regular landscapes, we don't recommend weed fabric it's not a sustainable landscaping practice. I see some pavers stacked up on the right there. So I was wondering if they're going to be putting in a large paved area, but I haven't seen yet the final installation. Next slide. Of course, you can also do flagstones and gravel pathways. Decomposed granite can be larger pieces, or it can be a very fine, kind of almost rock dust kind of material. The one thing about that fine material is that it can also become impervious over time as it gets compacted, or sometimes they compact it. I'm talking about the image on the right there. To me, it looks like gravel, but it could be the larger type of decomposed granite. Sometimes they even add a binder to the finer dust type of decomposed granite, and that can be an issue. Next slide.
All right, we have 2-minute warning, Peter.
Okay, thank you. I think this is one of my last slides here. So some things to consider for design and installation. If it's close to a building foundation, you do want to have some kind of a barrier in that case to keep the water from infiltrating into your building area. So it could just be on that one side of the installation. And you can try to slope the system away from the house, as we talked about with rain gardens as well. You may need a permit for certain larger amounts of installations. It depends on kind of how many square feet you have. So you might want to check with your city or public agency where you live, maybe the county. And you might want to get a contractor also if it's especially if it's going to have vehicles on it, because as I said, it's a little bit more of an engineered system. Next slide.
All right.
Okay, so we're ready for
Perfect.
Q&A. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. That was really informative. I learned a lot in this whole process, and one of the things I knew the least about was pervious pavement. So, and one of the questions we have here is one of the questions I asked when I first started learning about this. Are all concrete pavers pervious or only special ones?
Right. So I would say the most common is kind of like the cobblestone, right? Where that's the streets are made out of cobblestones, and they're just a type of impervious rock that's very strong and can stand up to the weight that's needed for that use. But nowadays they make them out of concrete, and they are very strong, and they have these interlocking tabs sometimes, like shown in this picture here, that helps to keep them straight and in place, and so they don't move around. You can also just use bricks, but bricks are not as strong as these concrete pavers, and so bricks would only be good for a pedestrian path. And so then there are the other types. One, and we have some more material for you, more information in a handout, and that you'll be getting. But there's lists of different types of companies, and in there's a one called a hydroflow paver, that where the water does flow through the paver itself. And there's even some that have hollow spaces inside to hold water too.
Right, but most pavers you find, like if you go to Home Depot and pick up some pavers, those pavers themselves, they're not pervious, correct?
Right, those would just be the standard concrete pavers probably.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Another question. I have a brick driveway. Can it help to simply drill holes in the areas between the bricks?
Yeah, I suppose if you fill that up with gravel, like I was saying, bricks can break, if they're not really well, if it's not constructed well with some gravel underneath it or rock. But in terms of the spaces between the bricks, yes. But the only downside of that is that you could have some settling if the soil starts, like if it's clay soil and now you're putting water into it, it could start to expand or contract when it gets dry. And then that expansion and contracting can also cause kind of differential settling, which could then cause them to break the bricks. So it's probably better to have the water slope to the sides or into these like the ribbon driveway that I mentioned, as opposed to in between with regular bricks. I don't think it's going to work as well.
Yeah, that leads to another question. Can I cut my existing concrete driveway and add strips of gravel?
Yes, definitely. And that's the depave. And I didn't mention there's it's an organization actually in Portland, and they have different chapters around the country called depave. And they have great videos on their website that shows you how to do that. They even show you how to rent a concrete cutting machine and how to use it. And you can get some friends, and you can, that's basically what they do. They have these depave parties with a bunch of volunteers, and they go around to different people's homes or even in schools, and they remove pavement.
Wow, great. Does pervious concrete stay pervious in the long term?
It can, as long as it's maintained. And so then there's a few factors in that. It depends, like I said, if you have a lot of leaves falling on it and you're not cleaning up the leaves, and then they turn into dust, and that dust can clog it up. Or if you have a dirt or soil area right next to your pavement that's always washing dirt and soil onto it. So it really depends on the design and the maintenance. But in general, and then they can be cleaned. They can be like kind of hydrojetted out or vacuumed out as well. If they get clogged up, you can sometimes unclog them, but they can last a long time.
Great. And then is there someone is having trouble finding a contractor for, oops, I've lost the question. Maybe it got answered live. I think it was for the pervious concrete.
Yeah, so there's a Bay Area Pervious Concrete Association. I believe we have the link to it in the resources that we're going to be giving you.
Yes. Okay. And then the final question is, are old red bricks pervious?
Not themselves. So the bricks themselves are made of clay typically. And so they're not pervious, but you can build a pervious system with them, like with the gravel in the gaps between them. But I wouldn't use it, like I said, for a driveway. I think it would be better for a pathway or a patio.
Great. Well, I think that is just right on time. We'll have to wrap up our presentations here. I just want to remind all the attendees again that we will be emailing out to you a link to download our fact sheet packet. It will have a few, like a lot of resources on these topics along with fact sheets, places to find more information, perhaps find a contractor and get help with your project. A recording of this webinar will be on our YouTube channel soon. And we invite you also to look at our website, sign up for our emails to learn about future events, follow us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. We have a great video library on our YouTube channel, and all the links to our social media will be in the follow-up email as well. So on behalf of the Clean Water Program, thank you so much for attending. We wish you the very best with your home improvement projects.